المشاهدون الكرام، أهلا وسهلا بكم في هذه الحلقة الخاصة من برنامج عزف منفرد. هذه الحلقة راح نتحدث عن أهم الآثار في حضارة وادي الرافدين وأهم الآلات الموسيقية في ذلك العصر وفي حضارات العراق القديمة من سومرية وبابلية وأكدية وآشورية. راح نذهب برحلة مع البروفيسور ريتشارد درامبل، وهو طبعا متخصص أو من القلائل المتخصصين في العالم في الحضارات القديمة والموسيقى في الحضارات القديمة والآلات القديمة، وأيضا واحد من المعتمدين والأوصياء في المتحف البريطاني، وأيضا مسؤول على كثير من طروحات الدكتوراه في العالم وخصوصا في جامعات بريطانيا، والباحثين المتخصصين في التنقيب والآثار، وخصوصا تنقيب والآثار الآلات الموسيقية في الحضارات القديمة. فبروفيسور ريتشارد راح ياخذنا برحلة وراح حقيقة يتحدث لنا عن تحديدا حضارة وادي الرافدين واختصاصه. بروفيسور ريتشارد حاصل على أكثر من شهادة دكتوراه وأكثر من شهادة ماجستير في التنقيب والآثار، وأيضا هو موسيقي وعازف بيانو متميز ومؤلف، وبنفس الوقت حصل على أستاذية يعني أي بروفيسور من عدة جامعات، والآن هو مسؤول على قسم الآلات الموسيقية في الحضارات القديمة في المتحف البريطاني. لنرحب سوية بالبروفيسور ريتشارد دامبرل، وراح ياخذنا في هذه الرحلة. وطبعا أضيف معلومة أخرى أنه بروفيسور ريتشارد زار بلدان عربية كثيرة منها العراق والمغرب وتونس ومصر ودول أخرى، منها بحث ومنها عمل ومنها زيارات للتعرف على الثقافة. هو يعتبر أيضا خبير بالثقافة العربية. فنرحب بالبروفيسور ريتشارد. Professor Richard, how are you doing?
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to have a chat with you.
في البدء راح نسأل سؤال هو كيف يستدل الآثاري على المناطق واللغة الأثرية، أو كيف يستطيع أن يعرف أنه هذه الأرض أو هذه المنطقة هي فيها لغة أثرية؟
Well, it is quite difficult, but for instance, in one of the most important sites, which is Ur, in southern Iraq, which was called Urim, then there was a mound which was called Del al-Muqayyar, which means the mound of pit of tar, because it was built with bricks, and the mortar between the bricks was tar, which of course went from the side of the bricks. So we knew that they might have something under there. And this is how we discovered the first of the big ziggurats in southern Iraq. And then of course, for the objects, following the example that we did in Egypt in archaeology, the places where you find most objects which are well kept is in cemeteries, in tombs. So therefore you find where is the tomb or the cemetery, and you dig it, and obviously this is where you will have most important objects. So whenever you have this, you go for the cemetery. So we are tomb raiders, basically. It's a combination of factors. We go with the ancient texts. One text which is quite important is the Old Testament, the Bible, because it says that this happened here and there.
Okay.
This is confirmed in Al-Quran, of course, and in other texts which are later. So we presume that the city was about there or there.
Okay.
Then we have aerial photographs, which show much more easier from the air, distinctions in the color of the ground and the vegetation, which might tell us that this is likely that we have some buildings buried. So it's a combination of all these factors which help us to choose this place or the other. And also quite often these ancient sites are still imprinted in the memory of the old people who say, oh, my grandfather used to tell me that found some old pots in this place. And all these factors combined make it that this is how we can locate sites.
Good. سؤالي الآخر ما هي أهم الآثار اللي تستدلون بها على وجود الآلات الموسيقية في حضارة وادي الرافدين وإلى أي زمن أو فترة تعود؟
This is difficult yet again, but we know, for instance, again from ancient Egypt, that whenever we found tombs, we found many musical instruments of all types. And therefore, the first archaeologists who dug in Iraq had the same processes. They thought that if we go in tombs, we will find musical instruments. Sadly, because in Iraq, in the time of Sumer, the tombs were not chambers, but it was really a burial interment when the bodies were buried and earth was simply pushed back on them. So therefore, the instruments that were buried with the kings and queens and noble people were simply crushed by tons of earth. So usually all that was built in wood disappeared completely. The only instruments that survived were those made of metal, such as the lyre, which is behind me, and because the metal resisted better than the wood to corrosion and to centuries of compression by the ground. Now, to date the period, it's usually through textual evidence. We will find along the bodies buried or the objects that we find sometimes some clay tablets, like this little bit here. And on these clay tablets, it will mention it was during the reign of King so-and-so, of Queen so-and-so, that, this happened. And therefore, the textual evidence is on the clay tablets allow us to determine the period. And then when we know more about the period and the objects, we can easily recognize by the look of a pot, the decoration, that this belongs to the beginning of the third millennium or later. So it's an accumulation, a progressive building up of data, allowing us to date things. And also the origin will be the color of the clay. For instance, if you show me clay from Iraq, I can tell you immediately, this is from southern Iraq, and this bit of clay is from northern Iraq. Because I know that in the rivers you have clays of different colors. So these are many factors determining the period and the origin of things that we find.
About the lyric or qithara, we know that the three kinds of the qithara we found. One is golden, one is bronze, and one with a silver. So do you think there is some thought that saying the normal or the ordinary people, they had a qithara but it was from wooden? But this is kind of qithara, metal qithara, have been founded with the maybe with the prince or the king or the queen or the thing. Do you think there is a lot of kind of qithara in the time of the Sumerian and have been made from different materials?
It appears that what you call qithara, which is the Greek word for it. So we can say qithara if you want. We are not yet sure about the Sumerian word for it. So I'm not going to give you any word for it. All we say it's a lyre or it's a qithara, that's good enough. Now, the fabrication of them, it is obvious that the soundboard was mainly made of raw hide, raw leather, because it's a material which hardens with the sun, when it's dry, it will never suffer from any splits in it, and will be the ideal material to transmit the sound of the strings to the instrument. Now, it is true that certain prestigious lyres, chitarra, were made of silver, gold, and adorned with semi-precious stones and animals' heads and so forth. But mainly from the evidence that we have on seals and other forms of depictions on bas-reliefs or whatever, it appears that the lyre was mainly used for the temple.
For the temple.
So it was an instrument which was used by musicians at the court of kings for the worship of the numerous gods.
You mean religious music?
Yes, mainly, we think. And we doubt very much that Mr. Ahmed whatever would simply decide to have one of these large instruments, because it would have been very expensive to build and very expensive to maintain. It is only later in the second millennium that we find smaller lyres which were affordable for the general public. But the big lyres of about 2600, 3000 BC were very big and very expensively made. And these were definitely not made for the general public.
اوكي سؤالي الاخر ما هي اول الاثار الموسيقيه عن آلة العود والى اي سنه تعود؟
The first, I believe, because there's some controversy there.
Okay.
I believe that the oldest representation of what we call oud would have been about 3,200 years BC.
Okay.
And it was represented on a seal impression and its cylinder that we have currently at the British Museum, which was acquired by my good colleague and friend Dr. Dominique Collomb in the 80s, on which there's a boat, and at the back of the boat there is a lady sitting, and she, we believe, played what was a small lute, but some believe it was an oar, a paddle. Rather than it was a lute. My hypothesis is when you have a paddle, you hold it firmly like this.
Yes.
And when it's a lute, you have more this position.
Yeah, maybe you open your fingers a little bit to make them ready to play by the fingers.
Exactly. This is why I believe that it's a oud rather than a paddle.
Okay.
It would be the oldest one. The next one comes from the Akkadian period. And we think about 2,300, 2,200. But I do believe really that the one on the seal impression was indeed from the Uruk period, about 3,200.
That means now, under this fact, we have to change the last information. We know that about 235 years or 3,350. We have to change it now. That means now we have to say 3,200 BC.
Yes, and there is something which is much more important than all this with the discovery of the lute. As you know well, being a distinguished oud player,
thank you.
That when you have a lute or an oud, the strings, one string will make different sounds. And they will make different sounds because you shorten or you lengthen the speaking length of the string by putting your fingers in the right place.
Yes.
Which means that you know about ratios, mathematical ratios.
That's right.
And if you have a lute, a oud, made 3,200 BC, it means that at the fourth millennium, during the fourth millennium, the Sumerians knew about ratios, mathematical ratios.
Excellent.
So this allows to tell us that the Sumerians were probably the inventors of ratios.
سؤالي الآخر، هل كان العود على شكله الحالي أم تغير؟ نحن نعرف ربما تغير، ولكن نريد أن نحصل على إجابة دقيقة من متخصص في هذا الجانب.
Yes, indeed. Well, the shape of the oud and the strings of the oud
Yes.
were mainly, I do believe that originally it would have been one of these fruits, like a melon, you know, like a calabash which was dried. It was cut in two, and this provided the body. Then a stick would have been the place where you would put the fingers, and the strings would have been made of animals' guts.
Okay.
We know this because the term Sumerian sa, it has got the equivalent of pitnu in Akkadian, and pitnu means a gut or tendon. So the gut would be twisted, or the sinew of the animal would be twisted in order to make the strings. And of course, this is even what we use today.
Yes.
So this tradition is extremely ancient. But of course, the string could have been made in other materials. We know that later in Iraq and in the Arabo-Islamic world, and especially in the 10th century, strings were also made of a certain number of silk strands,
That's right,
which were wound together.
Yes.
Later to be replaced by people such as Al-Kindi
Yes.
or Ziryab with the
yeah.
lion's guts, string
That's
of
right,
lion guts, so forth. But generally, the gut is the ideal material for the instrument.
For the instrument. And what about the face of the oud? Is the face of oud the same to the face nowadays, or have been developed, have been changed?
Well, we know from the Sumerian that the oud, the early one, might have been called gish gudi. Gish is a determinative, which means that the instrument was made of wood.
Okay.
Gude, we do not know. We know that the Akkadian equivalent is inu. This would be Innu in Semitic languages.
Okay.
But it is quite obvious that there again, the soundboard of the lute was made of skin, of leather, rawhide, which would have been stretched over the part of the calabash.
And something's related about the uruk. Do you think the name of the uruk or is related to the Iraq or not?
It is possible.
Fine.
There is a law in linguistics and philology which says be careful of sounds which sound alike. They are your worst enemies. And we try to avoid to make such comparison. When we have what we call homophony, that sounds which
homophonic,
we have to be very careful.
Yeah.
But I'm quite sure that there is a link.
There is a link.
Yes, but I would not be allowed to write this on a book. But I think there is a link.
سؤالي انه نحن سمعنا عن اول اوركسترا بالعالم، فرقه متكونه من آلات موسيقيه في الحضاره الاشوريه، فالى اي مدى هذا يقترب من الحقيقه؟ هل فعلا انه هذه الاوركستراهات او المجاميع الموسيقيه العالم كانت تتكون في الحضاره القديمه، خصوصا في حضاره وادي الرفدين؟ وهل صحيح انه اول اوركسترا بالعالم هي اشوريه؟
Well, the orchestra to which you refer has been very well recorded because of the Bible.
Yes.
And this orchestra is mentioned in the Bible. And therefore it was the most famous and the earliest. But then subsequent researches, namely in the ancient city of Mari, which is Tel Hariri between Syria and Iraq.
Yes.
Have showed to us some orchestras which indeed existed in 2400.
Okay.
So it's not a recent
BC,
thing.
you mean?
BC,
Okay.
yes. And they comprise very big harps, lutes, clappers, wooden clappers, and dancing. So the notion of an orchestra is far more ancient than the tradition of Ashur.
Yes.
We have evidence of it already in Tel Hariri at that period.
That means there is evidence and there is groups of the musicians.
Yes.
سؤالي الآخر، ما هي أغراض الموسيقى في الحضارة القديمة؟ هل كانت دينية أم كانت دينية وعسكرية هل كانت عاطفية؟ هل كانت حزينة؟ وما هي أنواع الموسيقيين؟ ما هي مراتب الموسيقيين أيضا في تلك الحضارة؟
Music is the extension of human beings' emotions.
Yes.
So from this, you have a full range of emotions, of course. If you are feeling angry with someone, your music will be military. We'll obviously have drums and we have loud instruments. If you are in love, well, the music will be mainly using the oud. If you, well, you see, you will use the musical instruments in function of what you want to express. But we know that music, sacred music, was intensively used in temple ceremonies in ancient Iraq, in ancient Mesopotamia. For instance, we have texts which describe at length how you would replace the skin drums of big kettle drums at the temple. It goes, by starting which cow you must select to slaughter. A cow must have no more than 7 black spots. Then the cow must be brought to the altar in the ziggurat, and then the priest must put a rope around the cow, feed the cow with certain food, then will whisper some special and magical incantations in each of the ear of the cow with a pipe, a reed pipe, and its long incantation. Then the cow will be slaughtered on this very day. Yes, it must be a special day. Then its food will be given to the temple priests. Then the skin will be treated with this type of salt and this type of alum to keep it, and then only you may put it on the drum. So you see, even the slaughtering of the animals for the temple purposes was very well recorded. So all instruments would have been subjected to the same type of treatment for the holy function that they represented. So temple music was very important. Then we have many representations on seal impressions, which are banquets, royal banquet, where the king and the queen usually sit in front of each other, and they have servants giving them beer, because beer was the drink they had. They had beer where they put in big pots and had long reeds, and were happily sucking the beer. I don't think the beer was very good at that time. And they also had wine, obviously. And so the king and the queen are celebrating something, perhaps the victory over another country for a battle or something. And so it's happy times. And generally the scenes which are street or peasant musicians are more difficult to find. We do not find them in seal impressions, which are for the rich people. We find them more on little clay statues. And usually the lute is not a sacred instrument at all. The lute is usually played by Elamite people, which are normally from southwest Iran, close to Iraq. Usually they are dwarfs and they have bended legs. They are usually naked and play the lute. So the lute is really a street, a country instrument. A folk instrument.
More than the royal,
not at all, never
music,
royal.
or temple music.
No, not at all. It was really a music for the people of the country, or working class people.
Maybe working class, or maybe wedding, maybe other things, other ceremony, and public ceremony.
Certainly not the religious, and certainly not the royal environment.
we classify the music? Is it, for example, we say this is royal music and this temple music, depend or lie on the, location and the place, or have we got some evidence about the music? Another question, is the royal music is different by melodic and by instruments comparing with the religious music?
Ooh, this is a very tricky question. Very tricky question.
Yes.
Because we have a few texts with music theory. Basically, we have 4 important texts, which tell us a lot. We have only one complete melody written from the beginning to the end, and then it's not written in the Semitic language. It's written in cuneiforms, but in the Hurrian language, which came from northeast Caucasus, but they moved to southwest Iraq in Ugarit. So the language is totally different. It's not Semitic. It's the only case of written music, and we know that this music was written for the moon goddess Nikal. We know that the composer was a certain Mr. Hammurabi. We know that the scribe was Mr. So-and-so, and they date from about 1400. So we have an idea of music for a goddess. Would it have been at the temple or played by folks in their homes? All we know is that the text is about a woman who is very sad because she cannot have any children. So she's very lonely. She therefore sings this hymn to try to ask the goddess Nikal that she might become pregnant. She may become pregnant.
سؤالي في محور آخر هو حول النوطة الموسيقية. سمعنا كثيرا عن نوطات موسيقية من الحضارات القديمة خصوصا ما قبل الإسلام. هل هنالك، أسأل أنا البروفيسور ريتشارد، أنه هل هنالك فعلا هنالك أدلة للنوطة الموسيقية نستطيع أن نترجمها ولو بشكل يعطينا فكرة عن الموسيقى في ذلك الوقت؟
This is very interesting. We have, as I said to you, 4 texts. There's one text which was written about 800 BC, but which was a copy of a much older text. And this text gives us the name of the strings of the one instrument. And so therefore we know that there's a first string, a second string, a third thin string, a fourth string created by the god Ea, fifth string, then fourth string from behind, third string from behind, second string from behind, and behind string. So they were written 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I've gotten ideas about this arrangement, but I don't want to go in details.
Yes.
That would be far too difficult to expose in a short time.
Okay.
Secondly, we know that from another text about the same period, but again the copy of a much...
Around, which period?
These tablets are from the first millennium BC.
First millennium.
But because they contain Sumerian terms within them, therefore I propose that these are much older and might come from the third millennium.
Third millennium.
And the second tablet, which we have, gives the names of intervals. And they gave intervals of the fifths. Depending on where they were placed, they had different names. And intervals of the thirds, which depending on which they are placed on the scale, have different names. This is very important because once you can define an interval and where it is, of course, then you have music notation.
Yes.
Also, the Sumerians and later the Akkadians were extremely clever because they used the mathematical system base 60 called sexagesimal to quantify the value of the notes. And the Greeks only did this about 2000 years later.
سؤالي الآخر بروفيسور ريتشارد هو طبعا واحد من العلماء القلائل اللي أعادوا بناء آلة القيثارة مرة أخرى وقدم عليها بعض الألحان الموسيقية. سؤالي إنه ماذا استطاع أن يستنتج من أولا كيف عمل إعادة بناء القيثارة، اثنين وما هي النتائج اللي حصلها من إعادة البناء هذا؟
It's a long story, but I will keep it short. Well, it starts. It was in 1969, that this instrument was completely at the museum, completely restored.
Okay.
And
which museums was?
at the British Museum.
British Museums. No.
And I visited this instrument in 1971, and I thought it was a terrible thing to do to it. It was, to my idea, so badly done that I said one day I will do something about it.
Okay.
And it's only a few years ago that I did something about it, so it took me quite a long time.
Yeah.
The reason is because now I was a young teacher. Of course, nobody at the British Museum would have allowed me to put my hands on this oldest known instrument in the world. But, you know, I made my career, and eventually, of course, I was allowed to touch it, to hold the real thing in my hands. And it was absolutely wonderful. But sadly, in the 1960s, the notion of conservation of instruments or whatever in museum was not the same as we have it today. We wanted to rebuild something to show it as close as possible as it would have been when it was made. So therefore this is what happened for the reconstruction of this Lai Kitara. And they wanted more a decorative element, object, than an object which allowed us organologists to make further studies. And because of this restoration, all the important evidence was completely lost. So when I reconstructed it with one of my students, it was part of a postdoctoral project. We went back to the original notes, which dated from the excavation of it, that is in 1928, 1929. We worked from the original photographs for the reports which had been written and for the original plans of conservation which had been made prior to the restoration. And we found that the replica which we made, which is behind me, varied quite importantly from the instrument that we have, the real instrument that we have in the British Museum. And this is a bit sad, but I suppose nobody is to blame because each period has its principles. But if it were to be redone, if I had the incredible luck to have the original instrument, you know, under my control today, I would have had a totally different approach to it. And I would leave it flat as it stood originally as much as possible, never to touch it in order to allow a more objective apprehension to what it, you know, to the state in which it was.
السؤال الآخر أنه ماذا حصل من نتائج من هذه الصناعة؟
It is extremely interesting. First thing, this silver instrument, the soundboard, was really made of a sheet of silver. So we know that in the third millennium, or the end of the fourth millennium, beginning of the third millennium, they already had the knowledge of metal soundboards that we have used later. I mean, the dobro, the American dobro, is a guitar with a steel soundboard. And in the 19th centuries, the British had pianos made with steel soundboards, so that they wouldn't be affected by the changes of temperature when they exported to India or other hot countries. So also the thing which might seem strange to have a metal soundboard, but what is important to note is that the sound conduction of a sheet of silver is almost as fast as the sound conduction in a plank of cedar.
ما هي الدلائل والإشارات على الإيقاعات في الحضارات القديمة وخصوصا حضارة وادي الرافدين. يعني احنا سمعنا عن الخلاخيل والخلخال والطبل والبندير. ما هي الدلائل التي حصلتم عليها على أقدم الآلات في حضارة وادي الرافدين؟
The kettle drum is one that is well known, very large kettle drums. We also have very, very big vertical drums, up to 6 or even 7 feet high. We have also evidence of instruments more like darbuka, and tar, you know, the tambourine, and the duf also. So mainly all these instruments, to which were added rattles of different types and clappers. But percussion is not that rich. And we have also very little evidence of wind instruments.
What about the kharkhasha? Oh, this is the shaking. Khalakhil, yes.
Well, they have come from very high antiquity.
Yeah.
And khalakhalatu became khalakhal and
khalakhil.
Yes, but sometimes the instruments vary. There were khalakhalatu, for instance, in the 3rd millennium.
Yeah.
And
the khalkhalatu is which language is the name?
In Akkadian.
In Akkadian it's called khalkhalatu.
Yes.
Yeah, which is khalakhil nowadays.
Khalakhil now and also we have names which change.
سؤالي الأخير، أنا أشارف على الانتهاء من الحلقة، والحقيقة يعني هذا المحادثة الثمينة والغنية يعني، وريتشارد بروفيسور ريتشارد لا نستطيع أن نلقاه بسهولة. أريد أسأل أنه الآثار هربت قبل 2003 ونهبت بعد 2003. ماذا يشعر رجل متخصص من القلائل بالعالم مثل بروفيسور ريتشارد حول هذه الحالة، وبنفس الوقت ماذا يعتقد ممكن أن نفعله لكي أن نعيد هذا الإرث الإنساني وأن نضعه في يد الجميع؟
The looting of the Iraqi museums are to a scale which makes of it a world disaster. It is absolutely terrible. The museum had been plundered. Everything that was made of gold was taken away. It was difficult for the looters to sell these objects because we know them by heart. I mean, you can show me any object which was from the Iraqi museum. I know it.
Okay.
I might not give you its number.
Yes.
But immediately if somebody showed it to me, this belongs to this museum.
Okay.
So you give it back. So this is why the items that were stolen were difficult to sell. So therefore, progressively they are returned back to the museums. But the problem, objects made of gold, well, the gold is melted often and then sold and it's gone.
Okay.
And this is very, very sad.
Okay.
Of course, gold was another metal. You see, the function of gold in the ancient world was not because gold is expensive. It's that gold was a marvelous metal. It never oxidized. Also, the problems are mainly also with the Museum of Baghdad, the Iraqi museum, that because it was closed and there was no electricity for a long time in it, that the collection of tablets, cuneiform tablets made of clay, had not been kept with air conditioning and were not, objects that were interested by the looters because it's just clay. But the problem is that there's always a quantity of salt in clay. And of course, because there was no control in the humidity, the salt crystallized and damaged enormously the surface of the tablets. So certain tablets, because of the lack of air conditioning, were simply destroyed. So we have hundreds and hundreds of tablets which are destroyed. That's it. And that's tragic. Dug out objects which were then smuggled into Syria, and then from Syria went to Europe. And because there were new objects, they were unknown to anybody, so we couldn't say where they came from.
Okay, that's
and because
new digging.
Yes, exactly. And because they were illicit digging, they have lost their value completely, because an object is important to us in the archaeology. If it was dug out from a known site, its position was reported, the layer in which it was found, and all this is lost. And the site where they were illegally dug out, of course, are also destroyed by this plundering. This is actually tragic, because it must be reminded to the world that Iraq is really the cradle of civilization. You've been at the museum, the British Museum. You've seen the efforts that were made, and indeed with the Italians, the French, and the British and others, we will manage something. But what is gone is gone.
That's right.
And never will be found again.
Professor Richard, I would like to thank you in my name and my all of audience in our program Solo Playing, and thank you very much for this is very beautiful journey. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Shukran.
Shukran.